On the cold highways that cut across America, a predator hunted in the shadows. For nearly a decade, he turned lonely stretches of road into killing grounds. They called him the Highway Killer. Larry Eyler didn't stalk neighborhoods or familiar alleys. He prowled the endless asphalt of the Midwest, where young men vanished into the night, never to be seen alive again. Welcome to Dark Radio, where true crime's darkest shadows are brought into the light. Tonight we uncover the chilling story of Larry Eyler, one of America's most brutal serial killers. The story of Larry Eyler doesn't begin with blood on the highways or headlines screaming the Highway Killer. It begins in the quiet, rural corners of Indiana in the 1950s, a world of broken families, hidden secrets, and a young boy growing up in the shadow of violence and rejection. To understand the predator he became, you first have to look at the fractured child he once was. Larry Eyler was born on December 21, 1952 in Crawfordsville, Indiana. The town was small, blue-collar, a place where church pews filled every Sunday and neighbors knew each other by name. But inside the Eyler home, the warmth of that small-town community never seemed to penetrate the walls. Larry's childhood was marked not by love and stability, but by chaos and neglect. His father was an alcoholic, prone to violent outbursts and unpredictable behavior. His mother, overworked and overwhelmed, struggled to keep the family together. The house was filled with tension, shouts in the night, slammed doors, long silences at the dinner table. The kind of atmosphere where a child learns early that safety is never guaranteed. For Larry, that instability left scars he carried long into adulthood. When Larry was a boy, his parents' marriage collapsed. Divorce in the 1950s carried with it not just personal shame, but social stigma, especially in conservative Indiana. Larry and his siblings were shuttled between relatives, experiencing the kind of rootlessness that erodes a child's sense of belonging. He never had a place he could truly call home, never had an anchor to hold on to in the storms of his young life. At school, Larry struggled academically. Teachers noticed he had difficulty concentrating, that he was impulsive and quick to anger. Other children avoided him. He became an outsider, a boy always on the edge of the playground, watching but never truly part of the group. That sense of exclusion gnawed at him, planting seeds of bitterness and resentment that would later grow into something far darker. By adolescence, Larry was already showing troubling signs. He had a hair-trigger temper, quick to lash out physically when frustrated or humiliated. His outbursts weren't just normal teenage defiance. They carried a simmering rage that frightened even his own family. He also began developing feelings he couldn't speak of in the world he lived in. Larry discovered he was attracted to other boys. In conservative 1960s Indiana, homosexuality wasn't just frowned upon, it was condemned, hidden, treated as a shameful sin. For Larry, these desires became a source of internal torment. He didn't have the language or the support to understand his sexuality. Instead, he absorbed the message from society around him that he was wrong, deviant, something to be hated. That shame took root deep inside him, curdling into self-loathing. And when self-hatred has no release, it often mutates into hatred of others. Eyler grew into a young man with a double life. On the surface, trying to appear normal, but inside, simmering with conflict. His relationships were unstable, his moods unpredictable. Friends recalled that he could be charming one moment and explosively angry the next. He was restless, never staying in one job for long, drifting between low-paying work as a house painter, laborer, or short-term hire. That instability mirrored his inner turmoil. He was always moving, but never moving forward. By the early 1970s, Larry was a young adult in a society undergoing cultural upheaval. The sexual revolution had opened doors for many, but not for him. In rural Indiana and conservative Illinois, being openly gay was dangerous. Bars and underground clubs provided some refuge, but they also became hunting grounds, not just for men seeking connection, but for predators who exploited the vulnerable. Eyler's double life deepened in these spaces. At night, he cruised highways, gay bars, and truck stops. He sought out young men, often those living on the margins, already vulnerable. At first, these encounters were about sexual release, but Eyler's violent streak soon bled into his intimate life. He tied partners up, pushed them past consent, took control in ways that left them shaken. Some walked away frightened but alive. Others would not be so lucky in the years to come. It was in these years that Eyler began forming the psychological blueprint of the killer he would become. He discovered that binding another person gave him a rush, a sense of dominance that temporarily silenced his inner chaos. The sight of fear in his victim's eyes was intoxicating, but like an addiction, the thrill faded quickly. To feel it again, he needed to escalate. Meanwhile, the broader world paid little attention. Larry Eyler was just another working-class man drifting on the edges of society. He wasn't famous, wasn't important. To neighbors, he was forgettable. But inside, his mind was darkening, his fantasies sharpening. He was rehearsing, building towards something bigger. By the late 1970s, his violent tendencies could no longer be dismissed as youthful anger. They were something far more dangerous. Eyler's encounters grew riskier, his cruelty more pronounced, and the highways that stretched across Indiana and Illinois began to call to him. To most people, they were roads to somewhere, paths to work, family, the future. To Eyler, they became corridors of opportunity, dark veins of asphalt where no one would hear the screams. The seeds of his later killing spree had already been planted. All it would take was one moment, one victim, for the fantasies to break into reality. And when that moment came, the Midwest would be haunted by a predator whose crimes still reverberate decades later. Larry Eyler was not born the highway killer. He was made. By violence, by rejection, by shame, and by his own hunger for power. The boy abandoned and belittled became the man who sought revenge against a world he believed had turned its back on him. And as the 1980s dawned, the body count was about to begin. When the 1980s began, Larry Eyler was no longer just a man wrestling with his demons. He was already rehearsing for murder. The fantasies that had haunted him in the shadows of his mind were about to spill into reality. And once that first boundary was crossed, there was no turning back. The Midwest highways, stretching across Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Wisconsin, were his hunting ground. Long ribbons of asphalt, bordered by woods and farmland, quiet enough to conceal the most unspeakable horrors. Eyler knew these roads intimately. His work as a house painter and odd-job laborer kept him constantly on the move. But while others saw miles of monotonous driving, Eyler saw opportunity. He saw young men standing on the shoulder with their thumbs out, looking for a ride. He saw the lonely figure in a rest stop, tired, desperate, with nowhere else to go. They were not strangers to him. They were prey. The early victims were often runaways, hitchhikers, or sex workers. Young men already discarded by society, men whose disappearances would not make the evening news, whose families, if they still had any, were fractured and scattered. Eyler picked them because he believed no one would notice they were gone, and for a time he was right. One of his first known victims was a teenager, barely 17. Eyler lured him in with the promise of a ride, maybe a little money. He knew exactly how to approach, offering something the boy needed, masking his predatory intentions behind a calm smile. But once the car doors closed and the road stretched empty ahead, the mask came off. The young man was bound with ropes, gagged and stabbed again and again. Eyler's rage poured out through the blade. The number of wounds, often dozens, was excessive, far beyond what was needed to kill. This was not about efficiency. It was about release. It was about domination. The body was dumped on the side of a rural road, left in a ditch where the autumn leaves would cover it. To Eyler, it was a clean kill. Quick, disposable. But for investigators, it would become the first piece of a bloody puzzle they couldn't yet see. Soon there were more. A young hitchhiker near Terre Haute, Indiana. Another boy from a gay bar in Indianapolis. A drifter picked up outside Chicago. Each victim fit a similar profile, young, male, vulnerable, and each death followed the same pattern: binding, stabbing, abandonment. Eyler struck with a combination of precision and frenzy. The control mattered to him. He needed his victims restrained, helpless, their fates entirely in his hands. But once the killing began, it became an eruption of violence, as if every ounce of anger and humiliation he had ever suffered was being carved into flesh. By late 1982, bodies were being discovered in ditches, fields, and wooded areas along interstate highways. Coroners reported horrific stab wounds, some victims having been pierced over 20 times. Forensic experts struggled to find clues. DNA testing was still primitive. Fingerprints and ballistics were useless in these cases. The victims had little in common except their gender, their youth, and the sheer brutality of their deaths. Law enforcement across multiple states began to realize they might be facing a single killer. But jurisdictional boundaries complicated the investigation. A body found in Indiana was handled by Indiana State Police. Another in Illinois was handled separately. Without central coordination, the murders at first looked like isolated incidents, tragic, but not connected. That disconnection was exactly what Eyler relied upon. He counted on the bureaucracy to buy him time. Eyler himself carried on as if nothing had changed. To neighbors, he was a quiet house painter who came and went at odd hours. To his occasional partners, he was unpredictable, sometimes affectionate, other times disturbingly aggressive. He had a boyfriend, John Dobrovolsky's, a man who tried to see stability in Eyler, but found himself instead living alongside a ticking time bomb. Friends noticed Larry's temper, the way he could suddenly explode into verbal or physical aggression. But no one suspected that behind those outbursts was a man already carving bodies into the soil of the Midwest. The killings grew bolder. Eyler began to travel further, his hunting grounds expanding. He would drive hundreds of miles in a single night, stalking rest stops, bars, or city streets. Each victim gave him a temporary high, but it never lasted. Within days, the craving returned. It wasn't lust alone. It was the intoxicating mixture of sex, rage, and power that only killing could provide. For Eyler, the knife became his signature. Guns were too impersonal, too quick. He wanted to feel the resistance, the tear in the flesh, the life ebbing out slowly under his hand. Investigators would later remark that his crime scenes revealed a man obsessed not with efficiency, but with the spectacle of suffering. The brutality was personal. The violence was overkill. The press had not yet caught on. The first bodies were local stories, tragic deaths of young men, some of them written off as dangerous lifestyles. But detectives were beginning to whisper about a pattern. Multiple stabbings, young male victims, highways as the common backdrop. Something was happening in the Midwest, something dark, something that couldn't be ignored for long. And Larry Eyler, living quietly, painting houses, smiling politely to neighbors, was already planning his next kill. He felt untouchable, invisible, a predator moving beneath the radar of law enforcement. But with each body he left behind, the trail was growing thicker, the pattern clearer. By the end of 1982, investigators across Indiana and Illinois had more than half a dozen unsolved murders with chilling similarities. The media finally began to give the killings a name, the highway murders. Fear spread through communities, particularly among young men who hitched rides or frequented bars along the interstates. A predator was out there, and he was growing hungrier by the day. Larry Eyler had crossed the threshold. He was no longer a man haunted by violent fantasies. He was living them. And soon the number of dead would climb into double digits, each new body a message written in blood across the highways of America. In the early 1980s, the American Midwest carried an uneasy silence. The endless highways of Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Ohio, once symbols of freedom and connection, had become hunting grounds, places where young men vanished into the night only to be found days later as lifeless corpses discarded along cornfields, drainage ditches, or forest clearings. Each discovery followed a grimly familiar pattern: bodies bound, beaten, stabbed dozens of times with merciless precision. The brutality was so consistent that investigators knew they were not looking at isolated murders, but at a serial predator who was leaving his bloody signature on every victim. The press soon gave him a name that would chill the public: the Highway Killer. Larry Eyler lived two lives. In daylight, he seemed unremarkable, an ordinary house painter, a man who frequented Chicago's gay bars, someone who laughed, drank, and blended into the city's marginalized community. But when night fell and loneliness gnawed at the edges of his mind, Eyler transformed. Behind the wheel of his battered pickup truck, he prowled the dark stretches of highway, watching, waiting, and searching for prey. He wasn't looking for just anyone. He sought young men who were vulnerable, transient, often estranged from family or living on society's margins. In Larry's eyes, they were perfect victims, easy to lure, easy to overpower, and tragically easy to erase without leaving much of a ripple in the world. The murders escalated with alarming frequency. In 1983, within a span of only months, multiple bodies turned up across state lines, their conditions so gruesome that even hardened detectives felt shaken. Eyler did not attempt to hide his crimes. On the contrary, his killings displayed a kind of savage exhibitionism. The deep stab wounds, the ligature marks carved into flesh, and the sheer violence of the attack seemed to scream a message. He wielded absolute power over life and death. To Eyler, each kill was not just an act of violence, but a grotesque ritual, a private performance in which he alone was both director and executioner. Detectives from various counties tried to piece together the puzzle, but the challenge was immense. Jurisdictional lines cut the investigation into fragments. Bodies found in different states meant different police departments, different rules, and little communication. Forensic science was not yet advanced enough to connect cases through DNA, and as a result, vital clues were lost in bureaucratic limbo. Eyler exploited this fractured system with chilling efficiency, moving freely across state borders, leaving his trail of corpses in fields and ditches, always staying one step ahead of the law. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, Eyler gave little away. He was sometimes quiet, sometimes even helpful, occasionally generous. Yet inside him festered an abyss of rage and desire. Whenever the pressure built up, he would retreat to the highways, prowling for hours until he found someone who matched his twisted fantasy. He often chose young men who looked uncertain, fragile, or simply alone, like flickering candles waiting to be snuffed out. The moment they stepped into his truck, their fate was sealed. As the killings continued, Eyler began to keep tokens from his victims. A bracelet, a pair of shoes, a small personal belonging, all became macabre souvenirs of his dominance. These objects served as reminders of the lives he had extinguished, as though each trinket was proof of his superiority over the world's laws and morals. Murder was no longer about fleeting urges. It became ritual, compulsion, a way for Eyler to assert control in a life otherwise mundane and insignificant. Fear spread like wildfire. Parents warned their sons not to hitchhike, not to accept rides from strangers. The LGBTQ community in Chicago whispered in hushed tones about a predator among them, a man with a pickup truck and eyes that seemed too cold, too calculated. Some suspected Eyler directly. He was known to be rough at times, his temper quick to flare, yet suspicion alone was not enough. Without evidence, he remained untouchable. He drank in the same bars, he mingled in the same spaces, all while hiding the darkness that drove him to kill again and again. For investigators, frustration mounted. Pins multiplied on investigation maps, each marking a body recovered, each a grim testament to another failure to stop the killer. Patterns began to emerge, the threads connecting cases across counties and states, but progress was painfully slow. Even when Eyler was temporarily detained for questioning after being spotted with a victim who later turned up dead, the law could not hold him. There was no direct evidence, no fingerprints, no weapon, no confession, and so Eyler walked free. Almost immediately, more bodies appeared. With every release, Eyler seemed to taunt the authorities, as if daring them to catch him. Detectives and journalists alike felt the despair of chasing a phantom. They could see his shadow, hear his echo in the screams of the dead, yet could not lay a hand on him. For the people of the Midwest, the highways became symbols of dread. What once represented freedom and travel now carried whispers of murder, each stretch of asphalt haunted by the thought that somewhere out there, a killer was watching from behind the wheel of a truck. Eyler continued to stalk his victims, night after night, as though the world had granted him permission to kill. The system's failures became his camouflage, and the loneliness of forgotten young men became his weapon. While communities trembled and families grieved, Larry Eyler drove on, eyes fixed on the next silhouette by the roadside, mind consumed by the darkness that defined him. To him, the Midwest highways were not just roads. They were hunting grounds, endless corridors where his secret kingdom of death could flourish unchecked and unseen. By 1984, the body count attributed to the so-called highway killer had risen to such a terrifying level that both the public and the authorities felt trapped inside a nightmare. Young men, many of them drifters, hitchhikers, or marginalized individuals from the gay community, continued to vanish. Their corpses, left in fields and ditches, showed the same brutal signs of torture and overkill. Ligatures burned into their skin, stab wounds carved deep and numerous, and an almost ritualistic cruelty that spoke of a killer who thrived on domination. Each victim's death added another layer of urgency to an already desperate manhunt. And yet, Larry Eyler still roamed free, smiling at neighbors, blending into bar crowds, and climbing into his pickup truck to stalk the highways. Law enforcement was in disarray. Dozens of police departments across multiple states had cases that fit the same horrific pattern. But in the 1980s, there was no central database, no unified investigative command to pull the puzzle pieces together. A sheriff in Indiana might know about 2 bodies. Detectives in Illinois might know about 4. Another agency in Ohio was chasing a similar case. Individually, they seemed like clusters of tragedy. Together, they painted the portrait of a serial killer, but that portrait was still fractured. Eyler relied on that disorganization. Crossing state lines became his camouflage, each jurisdictional boundary another layer of protection. But even predators can't remain invisible forever. By chance, one night in August 1984, an Illinois state trooper spotted Eyler's truck pulled over on the side of the road with a young man inside. Suspicion flared instantly. The trooper had been briefed about the ongoing manhunt and knew the descriptions. He questioned Eyler and noted the nervous passenger. But with no crime committed in that moment, he could only let them go. Still, the encounter set off alarms. Investigators began to watch Eyler more closely, sensing that they had finally brushed against the shadow they had been chasing for years. Soon after, Eyler was placed under surveillance. Detectives tracked his movements, his routines, and most importantly, his attempts to lure men into his truck. But surveillance is a slow and delicate process, and Eyler was restless. He continued driving, searching, and scheming. At last, in September 1984, the investigation caught a break. Police obtained a search warrant for Eyler's home and truck. What they discovered would unravel the secret life he had guarded so carefully. Inside Eyler's residence, investigators found rope, handcuffs, surgical tape, and a hypodermic needle, tools of control, restraint, and terror. These items alone weren't enough to secure a murder conviction, but they built a damning picture. Even more chilling were bloodstains recovered from his truck, stains that would later match one of his victims. The walls of denial Eyler had hidden behind began to crack. Forensic science, though primitive by today's standards, was finally catching up to him. Still, Larry was cunning. Interrogations revealed a man who could be both cooperative and evasive, alternating between calm explanations and cold silence. He admitted little, denied much, and often claimed that others were to blame. But the mountain of circumstantial evidence continued to grow. Witnesses placed him with victims. Blood and fibers tied his truck to murders. Step by step, the phantom of the highways was becoming a man of flesh and bone in the eyes of the law. The decisive moment came when Eyler was linked directly to the murder of Daniel Bridges, a 15-year-old runaway. Bridges' mutilated body had been discovered in a trash bag in Chicago, a crime so cruel and brazen that even the most jaded detectives recoiled. Blood and fibers from Eyler's apartment connected him to the killing. With that, prosecutors finally had enough to move forward. Eyler was arrested and charged with murder. The trial was a spectacle. The media swarmed, the public hungered for answers, and in the courtroom, Eyler's double life was laid bare. Prosecutors painted him as a sadistic predator, a man who prowled highways looking for young men to dominate and destroy. Defense attorneys tried to humanize him, portraying him as misunderstood, troubled, a scapegoat for unsolved crimes. But the evidence spoke louder than words. Rope, bloodstains, fibers, testimonies, they formed a web from which Eyler could not escape. In 1986, Larry Eyler was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The gavel strike was supposed to bring closure, but for many, it raised more questions. Eyler himself admitted to killing more men than he was tried for. Dozens, perhaps as many as 20. Some of these murders he described in chilling detail, offering information only the killer could know. Yet the full extent of his carnage may never be known. How many young men vanished into the highways because of him? How many families still wonder why their sons never came home? Eyler carried many secrets into his cell, leaving behind a trail of grief that no verdict could erase. In prison, his health began to deteriorate. By the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with AIDS, and the once defiant highway killer grew frail. Facing death not by execution but by illness, Eyler began to talk more openly. In interviews, he confessed to killings beyond his conviction, though always with a disturbing detachment, as if recounting errands rather than atrocities. Some investigators believed him, others thought he exaggerated, but each confession reopened wounds for families desperate for answers. He seemed to know that the power he once held on the highways could now be exercised in another way, through the information only he possessed, information that victims' loved ones craved. On March 6, 1994, Larry Eyler died in prison from complications of AIDS. With his last breath, he took with him the truth about many of his crimes. The highway killer's reign had ended, but his legacy of terror lived on in the unanswered questions, the cold cases scattered across state lines, and the nightmares of those who had crossed paths with him. The highways of the Midwest still stretched long and silent, but for those who remember the early 1980s, they remain haunted roads. Haunted not just by the bodies that were left behind, but by the shadow of a man who turned the freedom of the open road into a hunting ground. Larry Eyler had been caught, tried, and condemned, yet the scars of his cruelty linger, etched into the land and into memory, reminders that evil often moves in plain sight, disguised as an ordinary man behind the wheel of an ordinary truck, until it is too late. Larry Eyler's conviction in 1986 and the death sentence that followed might have seemed like the end of the nightmare. For the families of victims, it was at least a kind of justice, a confirmation that the phantom of the highways finally had a face, a name, and a cell number. Yet prison walls did not silence Eyler's voice, and death row became the stage for a new chapter in his story, a chapter where the killer traded in his knives and ropes for secrets, wielding his knowledge like a weapon just as potent as any blade. Locked away in a concrete box at Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois, Eyler waited for execution, but he knew his body was failing. In the late 1980s, he was diagnosed with HIV, and as the virus ravaged his system, it became clear that he would never live long enough to face the electric chair. That knowledge seemed to change him, or at least to embolden him. With time running out, Eyler began to speak, not out of remorse, but out of a twisted desire to remain relevant, to hold on to some last fragment of power. He began to confess. To his attorney, Kathleen Zellner, Eyler revealed that the murder of Daniel Bridges, the crime that had sealed his fate, was only one drop in a sea of blood. He admitted that he had killed more than 20 young men, perhaps as many as 21. Some of the names he gave were already known to investigators, their bodies long buried and cataloged as evidence. But others were still listed as missing persons, mysteries that haunted families for years. In his cell, Eyler recited details of the murders with chilling calm, where he had picked the boys up, how he had bound them, how the knife rose and fell again and again until the life drained from their bodies. There was no tremor in his voice, no sign of guilt. He spoke as if describing a chore, a routine. The repetition of his violence seemed to have dulled any distinction between one life and another. For Eyler, each boy was not a person but a vessel for his rage, a canvas upon which he carved his cruelty. Listening to him, Zellner noted how detached he seemed, how clinical, how cold. It was not confession for the sake of redemption. It was confession as performance, a final chance to remind the world of the terror he had inspired. Yet Eyler also introduced another name into the story, one that cast a darker shadow over the entire case. He claimed that he had not always acted alone. According to his account, a respected Indiana State University professor named Robert David Little had played a role in the killings. Eyler suggested that Little encouraged him, manipulated him, even assisted in some of the crimes. He described scenarios where Little provided financial support, shared in the sadistic fantasies, and reveled in the details of Eyler's murders. For investigators, this claim was explosive. Could it be that the highway killer was not just one man, but part of a disturbing partnership? The accusations against Robert Little ignited a storm. Police searched his home and found materials that seemed to corroborate Eyler's description of his interests: sadomasochistic pornography, writings filled with violent fantasies. But despite the suspicion, prosecutors struggled. Eyler's word alone, tainted by his notoriety and his manipulative tendencies, was not enough. Without physical evidence tying Little directly to the murders, the case against him faltered. He was indicted but later acquitted, leaving behind a cloud of doubt that still lingers in the narrative of Eyler's crimes. Whether Little was truly involved, or merely a projection of Eyler's twisted imagination, remains one of the most unsettling unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Eyler's health deteriorated rapidly. By the early 1990s, the AIDS diagnosis had reduced him to a shell of his former self. His body weakened, his time dwindled, but still he talked. To investigators, to journalists, to anyone willing to listen, he parceled out confessions like currency. Each admission drew headlines. Each detail fed the insatiable hunger of the public for the morbid truth. Families of missing boys begged for answers, desperate to know if their loved ones were among Eyler's hidden tally. For some, his words provided closure. For others, only deeper agony. Eyler's legacy became a cruel paradox. The only man who could deliver answers was the same man who had destroyed those lives in the first place. Behind prison bars, Eyler remained what he had always been, a manipulator. Some believed he exaggerated the number of his victims, inflating his infamy to secure his place in history among America's most notorious killers. Others believed every word, convinced that he had revealed only a fraction of the horror he had inflicted. Whichever version was true, the result was the same. Eyler retained control. Even in captivity, even as his body withered, he continued to dominate the narrative, ensuring that the world could never look away from him. By early 1994, it was clear that time had run out. AIDS had ravaged Eyler's body beyond repair. He was transferred to the infirmary, where each breath came with visible effort, each word carried the rasp of a dying man. In those final days, Eyler seemed to accept his fate. He gave his last statements not as apologies, not as pleas for forgiveness, but as one final declaration of who he was: a killer of men, a destroyer of innocence, the shadow on the highways. On March 6, 1994, Larry Eyler died of complications from AIDS, alone in his prison bed. The state never carried out his execution, but death found him nonetheless. The moment his heart stopped, the corridors of Pontiac Correctional Center fell silent, and with it, many of his secrets were buried. Some cases were closed because of his confessions, but others remain unsolved to this day. Dozens of families are still left with questions, still haunted by the possibility that their missing sons were among Eyler's unnamed victims. For law enforcement, his death was both a relief and a frustration. The predator was gone, but so too was the chance to extract more truth, to recover more names, to offer more closure. In death, as in life, Larry Eyler left behind a trail of unanswered questions and fractured families. His reign of terror had ended, but the scars remained, carved deep into the memory of the Midwest, etched into the history of American true crime. In the end, Larry Eyler's time on death row was not a period of redemption or reflection. It was another extension of his cruelty. He used his confessions the way he once used his knife, as instruments of control, piercing the hearts of those who sought peace. He died not as a penitent man, but as a manipulator to the last breath, a man who transformed his own downfall into yet another weapon against the living. When Larry Eyler's body was carried out of Pontiac Correctional Center on March 6, 1994, it seemed as though a nightmare had finally ended. The man who had terrorized the highways of the Midwest, the predator who left dozens of young men dead along roadsides and in fields, was gone. Yet his death brought no true sense of closure. Instead, it left behind an unsettling silence, a silence filled with unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and a legacy that continues to haunt law enforcement, survivors, and families of the missing. For many parents, Eyler's death was another theft. They had waited for years to confront him in court, to demand answers, to see justice served in the form of an execution. But disease robbed them of that moment. Eyler slipped into death on his own terms, never forced to face the finality of the state's judgment. His execution had been promised. Instead, he died of natural causes, a cruel twist that left families feeling cheated. In their eyes, he had once again escaped. Even more painful were the mysteries that died with him. Eyler admitted to killing at least 21 young men, but investigators could only confirm a portion of those claims. He described scenes of violence that matched unsolved murders, yet others were vague, with no names attached, no bodies recovered. For every confession that provided closure, there was another that opened a fresh wound, leaving families in limbo. Mothers and fathers sat with the haunting knowledge that their sons might have crossed paths with Eyler, but without definitive proof, they could only endure the torment of uncertainty. The Midwest highways, dotted with towns and truck stops, became a graveyard without headstones, haunted by boys whose stories ended in shadows. Law enforcement, too, carried the weight of failure. Eyler's killing spree exposed cracks in the system, cracks that allowed a serial killer to cross state lines with impunity. Each jurisdiction guarded its own files, communication between agencies was minimal, and technology was primitive. If DNA databases and centralized task forces had existed then, Eyler might have been caught sooner, sparing dozens of lives. Instead, investigators were left chasing fragments of a puzzle they couldn't fully assemble until it was too late. The case became a painful lesson, a grim reminder that predators thrive in the gaps of bureaucracy. In the years that followed, the Eyler investigation would be cited as a catalyst for reform, a reason for stronger cooperation between states, and the birth of more sophisticated criminal databases. But beyond the systemic failures lay the deeper horror of Eyler himself. He was not the monstrous figure of folklore, not a grotesque phantom hiding in the woods. He was a man who painted houses, who drank in bars, who shook hands and smiled and passed unnoticed on crowded sidewalks. He was ordinary, and that ordinariness is what makes his story terrifying. Evil did not come dressed in horns or cloaked in darkness. It came in the form of a neighbor, a friend of a friend, a man driving a pickup truck along familiar highways. Larry Eyler reminded the world that the most dangerous predators can wear the most unremarkable faces. His confessions in prison also raised disturbing questions about complicity. Was Robert Little truly his accomplice, or was he a scapegoat Eyler named to keep the spotlight on himself? The courts acquitted Little, but the doubt remains. Some investigators believe Eyler's crimes bore the marks of collaboration, that certain scenes suggested more than one set of hands. Others argue that Eyler was perfectly capable of such violence on his own, that he invoked Little's name only to deepen the intrigue. The truth lies buried, like so many of Eyler's victims, in a place we may never reach. What endures, however, is the shadow he cast over the highways of America. To this day, his name conjures images of desolate roads and vanished boys, of headlights cutting through the night toward an inevitable doom. His crimes changed the way people view travel, hitchhiking, and trust among strangers. For the LGBTQ community, his story carried a double tragedy. Not only were the victims often young gay men, but their disappearances were sometimes dismissed or minimized by society at large, leaving them even more vulnerable. Eyler exploited that indifference, targeting those he believed no one would miss. In doing so, he revealed the dark intersection between personal evil and societal neglect. Decades later, Larry Eyler's story remains one of unfinished business. Cold cases still linger in police files. Bones occasionally surface in fields, and each discovery raises the same haunting question: was this another of Eyler's victims? Families still wait for answers, clinging to the faint hope that modern technology might one day close the gap between confession and proof. Yet with Eyler gone, the possibility of complete resolution vanished with him. The highway killer left a trail of blood across 4 states, and though his truck has long since rusted and his body has decayed, his presence endures in memory, in nightmares, and in the cautionary lessons of criminal justice. In the end, Larry Eyler's legacy is not just a tally of lives he stole. It is the reminder that monsters can live among us unseen, shielded by the cracks in our systems and the blindness of our assumptions. His story is not only about murder, but about trust betrayed, innocence destroyed, and the fragility of safety in a world where evil can wear the mask of the ordinary. His reign may have ended in 1994, but the echoes of his cruelty still whisper along the highways he once prowled, where headlights cut through the dark and every shadow feels like a threat. If the shadows of the story unsettled you, you're not alone. Evil often hides behind the most ordinary faces. Subscribe to Dark Radio for more real-life darkness brought into the light. And remember, justice may sleep, but it never dies.